Everyone thinks South Park gets censored the same way every show does. A complaint, a pulled episode, a network apology. But out of more than 300 episodes, only 5 are completely gone from every streaming service. And the strangest one aired 9 years without a single objection. In this video, we break down every censored South Park episode. An elephant makes love to a pig. The first cut South Park first hit television in August of 1997, and almost nobody at Comedy Central was sure it was going to work. The channel was not the big deal it would eventually become, and the show was unlike anything it had aired before. 4 kids from a tiny mountain town in Colorado, animation that looked like it was made from construction paper, and voices that sounded like adults doing a pretty bad job of imitating children. The whole thing felt rough around the edges, and honestly, that roughness was not really a choice. Parker and Stone were doing everything at once, writing the episodes, directing them, doing most of the voices, and keeping the animation moving, all at the same time, inside a schedule that gave them only a few days to finish each episode before it had to go out. There was no time to slow down and second-guess anything. That pressure is actually a big part of why the early seasons feel the way they do, like 2 people figuring out what they are making while they are already in the middle of making it. 5 episodes into that first season, the show aired an entry called "An Elephant Makes Love to a Pig." The title is exactly what it promises. The main storyline follows Kyle's attempt to breed his pet elephant with Cartman's pig, a project for a genetics class where Mr. Garrison has been explaining the principles of genetic engineering and how it might be possible to combine traits from different animals into something new. Kyle takes the assignment completely seriously, spending the episode actually trying to get the crossbreeding to work at a laboratory outside of town. Cartman, not to be outdone and deeply competitive by instinct even in situations that do not require competition, bets a classmate named Terrence that he can clone an entire human being before Kyle manages to produce a single pot-bellied elephant. The main plot is lighthearted and deliberately absurd, built on the show's already established habit of letting children pursue adult-scale ambitions with complete deadpan sincerity, while adults behave with the reliability of people who have never once been counted on. Running alongside this main story is a subplot involving Stan and his older sister Shelly, and it is this second storyline, the one with almost no connection to the genetic engineering premise, that would eventually make An Elephant Makes Love to a Pig the first South Park episode to be cut by the network. The only reason the subplot exists at all, according to Parker's own accounts, is personal. His real sister is also named Shelly. The dynamic between them growing up apparently provided enough material that Parker felt comfortable transplanting it directly into the show, turning a childhood memory of being physically overpowered by an older sibling into a cartoon subplot about a boy who cannot escape his own sister's wrath. This origin gives the Shelly scenes a texture that is slightly different from the show's broader satirical material. The adult incompetence in the genetic engineering plot is exaggerated for maximum comic effect. Shelly's attacks on Stan feel closer to something that might actually happen in a real house, drawn from experience rather than from the logic of a joke, which gives them a specific kind of unpleasantness that sits a little differently than the show's usual register of cartoon violence. Shelly attacks Stan repeatedly throughout the episode. She is bigger, older, and completely uninterested in anything resembling restraint. The adults around Stan fail to notice or respond to what is happening, a pattern the show would return to many times across its run when it wanted to show children trapped inside situations that adults were structurally incapable of seeing clearly. The beatings escalate as the episode moves toward its end. At one point, the escalation reaches a moment that, when the show's original broadcast was finished and reruns were being prepared, someone inside Comedy Central decided needed to come out. Shelly lights Stan on fire. The scene, in its original form, shows her setting him ablaze and then dousing him with a bucket of water, a sequence that apparently cycles through at least once within the same exchange before the episode moves on. Stan burns, screams, and survives the way cartoon characters always survive, because the show had not yet established the tradition of Kenny dying permanently at the end of each episode. In context, the fire fits the physical danger the subplot has been building throughout the episode. The escalation from beatings to fire is extreme, but within the show's internal logic at that point in its run, it lands as a natural peak for a story that has been moving towards something worse with every scene. The episode went out on September 10th, 1997, with the fire intact. No internal flag appears to have been raised before the broadcast. The show was new enough and the production timeline fast enough that Comedy Central had not yet developed the same level of advanced review that a longer-running program might have had in place. The original airing came and went. The sequence burned, the water bucket appeared, and the scene ended. For that single broadcast, it was simply part of the episode. The decision to remove the scene before future airings was not driven by viewer complaints. No record of public outcry exists from the original broadcast. No religious organization issued a statement. No parent group filed a formal complaint with any regulatory body. The cut happened because of something that had occurred 4 years earlier in a different different state, involving a different animated show entirely and a dead child whose story had never fully left the television industry's institutional memory. In 1993, MTV aired an episode of Beavis and Butthead in which the two main characters set fire to a comedy club. The episode was called Comedians. Beavis and Butthead was, at the time, one of the most discussed and most criticized shows on television, regularly targeted by parent advocacy groups and legislators for what they considered its irresponsible portrayal of adolescent stupidity. The show's entire comedic premise depended on its two protagonists being as comprehensively foolish as possible, and fire had appeared in the series before as one of the things that excited them beyond their usual level of stupefied enthusiasm. After Comedians aired, a 5-year-old boy in Ohio set his family's trailer home on fire. His 2-year-old sister died in the blaze. The boy's mother, in accounts reported at the time, said her son had been watching Beavis and Butthead before the fire started. The causal link between the episode and the fire was never proven in any formal sense. The circumstances were more complicated than early reporting suggested, and the question of whether a 5-year-old watching a cartoon was the actual reason a fire started was not something anyone could establish with certainty. But the story spread, it generated enormous coverage, and it attached itself to the show in a way that could not be undone, regardless of what subsequent investigation suggested. MTV responded by editing the series going forward, removing or altering content involving fire, and the incident became a standing example inside the television industry of what could happen when an animated show put a child and fire together on screen at the same time. That example was still sitting in the background of Comedy Central's awareness in September of 1997. The network was airing a new animated series aimed at adults that was already generating attention for its language and its content, and its 5th episode had just broadcast a sequence where a child set another child on fire and put her out with a bucket of water. Whether the decision came from a single executive or from a broader internal conversation, Comedy Central cut the fire sequence from "An elephant makes love to a pig" before reruns began. Nothing was said publicly, no announcement was made. The decision did not generate a press release or a statement from Parker and Stone or a response from any outside organization. The scene simply was not in the episode when it aired again, and that absence was the entirety of the public record of what had happened. What replaced the fire sequence in the edited version was one of the stranger artifacts in South Park's long history of its own edited material. When the altered version of the scene aired and later appeared on VHS and DVD releases, Shelly's attack ends, and Stan is left sitting in a puddle of water. No explanation is offered for the puddle. The fire that would have produced the need for a bucket of water is gone. The bucket of water itself is gone. All that remains is the water on the ground, present without any cause the episode is willing to provide. A visible seam in the edit that makes no sense to anyone watching the scene for the first time and has no reference point in anything else the subplot establishes. The DVD commentary for the episode, recorded years after the original broadcast, when Parker and Stone sat down to provide audio commentary for the show's home video releases, contains a moment that has been passed around among serious fans of the series for years. Both creators listen to the scene with Stan sitting in the mysterious puddle and express genuine confusion about why the water is there. Neither of them can recall what was filmed or removed. Neither of them has a clear memory of the original sequence or the circumstances of its removal. The puddle sits there on screen while the people who made the episode try to figure out what they are looking at inside their own work. The fire had been cut early enough and quietly enough that it had simply moved on from the show's working memory, leaving a detail in the surviving edit that nobody could explain because nobody who remembered making it was still connected to the decision. This moment of confusion is not a small thing. It speaks to how completely the removal was handled, not with the kind of public negotiation and institutional pressure that would define every other major censorship event in South Park's history, but with a swift internal cut that left no paper trail anyone working on the show could later point to. The puddle became, accidentally, the only remaining evidence that something had once been in that scene, a ghost of footage that aired once in 1997 and never officially appeared again. The high-definition remaster of the episode, produced when the show was prepared for Blu-ray and digital streaming distribution, removed the puddle entirely. The scene in its current form simply shows Stan in the moment after Shelly's attack, with no water anywhere nearby and no visual artifact of any kind to suggest that anything was ever different. The fire sequence has now been scrubbed not just from the episode's content, but from any visible trace of its former presence. The original footage, which broadcast once in the fall of 1997, has never appeared in any official release. It has not surfaced on DVD, Blu-ray, or any streaming platform in any form. Whatever recordings exist from that original broadcast exist outside the official record entirely. This makes the fire scene in An Elephant Makes Love to a Pig something genuinely unusual in the context of South Park's long history, a piece of the show's own production that has been officially lost, not because it was technically impossible to preserve, but because the institutional decision to remove remove it was made so early and executed so completely that it became part of the edit before anyone thought to preserve an alternative. Most of South Park's censored content is censored in ways that leave the censored version publicly available, alongside some record of what was changed. The fire scene has no censored version. The original is simply gone from the record, replaced first by a puddle and then by nothing at all. The most important thing about this first censorship case, when looking at everything that would follow across the show's next 3 decades, is what kind of concern drove it. Every subsequent significant censorship event in South Park's history would be connected to organized opposition of some kind. A religious group, a corporate interest, a foreign government, a political organization with staff and funding, and a public-facing strategy for applying pressure. The decision to pull the fire scene from An Elephant Makes Love to a Pig was driven by none of that. There was no organization demanding it. There was no public pressure requiring a response. There was a memory of what had happened in 1993 and a calculation, made quietly inside a network's own offices, that the same story should not be allowed to happen again with this show as the named cause. This is also the only case in the show's entire history where the removed content had nothing to do with the intent or meaning of what was being satirized. The Shelley subplot was not trying to make a point about fire safety, or about sibling violence, or about anything in particular beyond the specific physical reality of Stan's home life and the parallel dynamics Parker had experienced growing up. There was no lesson being communicated that someone chose to suppress. There was simply a dangerous thing depicted on screen, and the concern that a child might see it and try it, regardless of everything else the episode was doing around that single moment. That concern, stripped down to its simplest form, is about something more primitive than any of the religious or political objections that would fill the years ahead of it. It does not require an audience to misread a joke or miss a layer of satire. It does not require a community to feel insulted or a corporation to feel threatened. It requires only a child, a piece of footage, and the possibility that what one produces will affect what the other does. The network looked at Shelley lighting Stan on fire and thought about a 2-year-old in Ohio and cut the scene before anyone could find out whether the same calculation applied. An Elephant Makes Love to a Pig itself survived intact in every other respect. The genetic engineering plot, the cloning subplot, every other moment of Shelley's violence against her brother, the episode's resolution, all of it remained in the version that went out to reruns and later to home video. The cut was narrow and specific, touching only the seconds of footage where the fire appeared, leaving the surrounding episode fully in place. The episode is available to stream right now. Most people who have seen it have no idea anything was ever removed, because the current version gives them no reason to suspect it. The show's censorship history would grow considerably more dramatic, more public, and more consequential in the years that followed. But it started here, with a puddle of water that nobody who made the show could later explain, sitting quietly in the middle of a season 1 episode that almost nobody remembers for this reason at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The fire scene in An Elephant Makes Love to a Pig was removed before the show had finished its first month on the air, so quietly that even its creators lost track of what was cut. Every censorship battle that followed would be louder, more public, and far more complicated, starting with an episode that aired 3 years later and contained a scene so graphic that the network waited until after broadcast to ask for it back. Section 2. Proper condom use. After the broadcast, by the time South Park reached its 5th season in the summer of 2001, the show had already established something that no amount of protest or criticism had been able to dislodge: a reputation for doing things on screen that no other program on cable television was doing. The first 4 seasons had built a fan base large enough and a critical profile strong enough that the show was no longer the strange new arrival that Comedy Central had quietly taken a chance on back in 1997. Parker and Stone had won a Peabody Award. The show had been nominated for Emmy Awards. Its characters had moved into pop culture far enough that even people who did not watch it could identify Cartman and Kenny by name. The controversy that attended almost every major episode had not hurt the show's standing in any meaningful way. If anything, the pattern of outrage followed by continued viewership had demonstrated that South Park could absorb public objection without losing its audience, which meant Parker and Stone were entering season 5 with more institutional confidence behind them than they had ever previously enjoyed. That confidence shaped how they approached an episode in the 7th slot of that season called Proper Condom Use. The premise is built on a straightforward comic escalation, the kind the show had been perfecting since its earliest episodes. The boys at South Park Elementary are caught doing something involving their dogs that the adults in their lives find deeply inappropriate, a situation that prompts every parent in town to simultaneously conclude that their children need immediate and comprehensive sex education. The school responds by having the teachers provide this education, which immediately becomes the problem, because the teachers at South Park Elementary are among the least qualified people imaginable to explain anything about human sexuality reality to fourth graders. The episode's central joke is about how an attempt to protect children from ignorance manages to produce something considerably worse than the ignorance it was trying to replace. The sex education classes unfold in two parallel streams. The boys receive instruction from Mr. Garrison, the show's perpetually inappropriate teacher, while the girls receive instruction from Ms. Choksondik in a separate classroom. Both streams quickly move into territory that no actual school would allow, with each teacher bringing their own specific combination of incompetence and misdirection to the task. The boys come away from Mr. Garrison's class convinced that sex is something that will kill them. The girls come away from Ms. Choksondik's class convinced that all boys are essentially predators who must be treated as enemies. By the episode's midpoint, the misunderstanding between the two groups has escalated into a standoff that the show frames as a kind of small war, with the boys and girls of South Park Elementary treating each other as opposing forces in a conflict that began entirely because the adults tasked with explaining something failed to explain anything correctly. This is the satirical engine the episode is built around. The idea that the adults most concerned with protecting children from sexual ignorance are frequently the ones least equipped to replace it with anything useful. The joke extends to include Mr. Mackey and Miss Choksondik, who end up in their own subplot that collides with the main storyline in one of the most graphic sequences the show had produced up to that point. Their encounter is explicit in a way that goes well past what most animated programs had attempted, and Parker and Stone animated it with a level of visual detail that appeared to be daring the network to say something about it. That scene, memorable enough that longtime viewers still bring it up when discussing the episode, aired fully intact on its original broadcast and was not cut for reruns. It remains in the version that streams on Paramount Plus today. The scene that did get cut was something else entirely, and understanding which specific moment Comedy Central eventually drew a line around requires looking at what Mr. Garrison does during his sex education class. As part of his instruction, Mr. Garrison demonstrates proper condom use using a model. The demonstration itself is not unusual as a concept. Sex education teachers routinely use models to show students how to use condoms correctly, and the premise of an adult showing fourth graders how this works is already part of the episode's broader comedy about inappropriate sex education. What makes Mr. Garrison's demonstration specific to this episode is the method he chooses to employ. Rather than using hands, he uses his mouth, demonstrating the application of a condom to the model in a way that the DVD commentary describes in terms that make clear exactly how explicit the original footage was. The full uncut version of the demonstration was graphic enough that Parker and Stone themselves acknowledged in later interviews that it went considerably further than what eventually appeared in broadcast. Here is where the timeline of censorship in this particular episode becomes unusual relative to almost anything else in the show's history. Comedy Central had seen enough of the episode before broadcast to raise concerns about the Garrison demonstration scene specifically. According to the show's DVD commentary, the network told Parker and Stone well before the episode aired that they needed to drastically shorten the sequence. This was not a post-broadcast demand, it was a pre-broadcast censorship request, the network asking the creators to cut something before it had reached audiences at all. Parker and Stone, by that point in their relationship with the network, were not in the habit of simply accepting editorial notes on their content. They had spent 5 seasons building a show whose identity was inseparable from the willingness to include exactly the kind of material networks typically asked their shows to remove. The request to shorten the Garrison scene was apparently received and then, to a significant degree, set aside. The scene aired. The full original version, or something very close to it, went out on the episode's first broadcast on August 1st, 2001, without the cuts the network had asked for in advance. The version that aired was not entirely unaltered, it appears, from the absolute maximum of what Parker and Stone had originally filmed. The sequence reportedly cut away at a specific point rather than showing the most explicit possible version of what Mr. Garrison was doing. But what made it to air was still considerably more than Comedy Central had indicated it wanted on screen, and considerably more than anything that would appear in any subsequent airing of the same episode. The network's pre-broadcast request had not produced the cut it was looking for, and the episode had gone out anyway with the scene still substantially intact. After the broadcast, Comedy Central returned to the question with considerably more force than it had been able to apply before the episode aired. The network made clear that the version of the Garrison demonstration that had gone out on August Fun would not be used for reruns. A shorter version of the scene, edited to remove the most explicit portion of the demonstration, would replace it for all future broadcasts. Parker and Stone appear to have accepted this post-broadcast demand in a way they had not accepted the pre-broadcast request, and the edited version has been the only one available in any official format since. This sequence of events, a pre-broadcast request ignored, a first airing that went out substantially as intended, and then a post-broadcast demand that produced the cut the network had wanted all along, reveals something specific about how the relationship between Parker and Stone and Comedy Central actually operated at that point in the show's run. The creators had enough standing and enough confidence in their own creative judgment that they were willing to defy a pre-broadcast note from the network and air what they wanted to air, betting that the episode would go out before the network could enforce anything. The network, for its part, appears to have been aware that its leverage was greater after a broadcast than before one, since a demand to change something already aired could be framed as preventing it from happening again rather than as a creative override, which is an easier institutional argument to make. The result was that the complete Garrison demonstration exists now in one place only, in whatever recordings survived from that single August 2001 broadcast. It is not on the show's DVD releases, which contain the edited version exclusively. It has not appeared on any streaming platform. The DVD commentary for the episode notes specifically that the censored version is what appears on the disc, which is a more direct acknowledgement of the cut's existence than the show's first censored episode ever received. Parker and Stone describe what was in the original scene on the commentary track, which means anyone who listens to it gets a fairly clear picture of what was removed even while watching a version that does not contain it. The episode's international distribution added another layer of censorship that operated entirely independently of what Comedy Central had decided about the Garrison scene. Sky One in the United Kingdom refused to air proper condom use at all, citing the episode's sexual and violent content as exceeding what the channel could broadcast. This is notable because Sky One had been airing South Park through its earlier seasons without refusing any episode, meaning the specific combination of content in this particular episode crossed a threshold for that network that previous episodes had not. Taiwan also declined to air the episode. Channel 4 in the United Kingdom, operating under a different set of broadcast standards than Sky One, did air it without cuts. The episode's treatment in different countries was not uniform, which tells you something about how differently various broadcasting environments drew the line between content that could reach an audience and content that needed to be removed or withheld. None of these international decisions generated the kind of public controversy that other South Park censorship events would produce. The Garrison scene had already been cut domestically before most people knew what the uncut version contained. The international bans happened quietly, resolved within each broadcasting environment according to its own standards, without the kind of organized response from either side that characterized later censorship battles involving religious organizations or government bodies. Proper condom use is available today on Paramount+. Someone watching it right now would have no reason, without prior knowledge, to look for a cut. The edited version of the Garrison scene still contains enough for the joke to work, and the broader episode surrounding it remains one of the more extreme things the show produced in its earlier seasons. What makes this case worth understanding carefully within the larger history of South Park's censored episodes is the specific nature of what was removed and why. The fire scene in the show's first major cut was taken out because of concern about imitative physical danger, a worry that had nothing to do with the episode's content being offensive. The Garrison scene was cut for a different reason entirely, one that sits closer to the more conventional understanding of what makes content censored. The sequence was sexually explicit in a way that crossed a line the network had decided it could not allow to remain in permanent rotation, regardless of the satirical context surrounding it. Comedy Central was not worried about children imitating the demonstration. The concern was simpler. The scene was too graphic for the network's standards, full stop, and the post-broadcast demand to remove it was driven by that judgment rather than by any outside pressure. This distinction matters when looking at the full picture of how South Park's censored episodes actually came to be censored. Most of the famous cases involve religious groups, death threats, foreign governments, or corporate relationships applying pressure from outside the network. The Garrison cut was purely internal, the same kind of editorial decision that any network might make about any show's content after seeing what it actually aired. The unusual element is that it happened after broadcast rather than before, because the pre-broadcast attempt to prevent it had not produced the result the network wanted. The episode itself, with the cut in place, continued to circulate for years without the censorship becoming a major public story. Proper condom use is not on any list of South Park's banned episodes. It is not among the 5 entries currently unavailable on streaming. It sits in the show's full catalog, fully accessible, carrying no obvious external sign that anything in it was ever different from what an audience can see today. The censorship it received was narrow, internal, and resolved without public comment from either side. In that sense, the episode represents something slightly different from all the more dramatic censorship battles ahead of it. A case where the network's standards and the creator's ambitions collided at the point of a single scene, and the network won the argument, quietly, after the episode had already aired. Parker and Stone had shown, in the way they handled the pre-broadcast request, that they would not simply adjust their content in response to a note from the network when they believed the content belonged in the episode. Comedy Central had shown, in the way it handled the post-broadcast demand, that it had tools available after a broadcast that it did not always have before one. Both parties understood the terms of their relationship a little better after this episode than they had before it, which is why the next censorship battle in the show's history history would operate very differently and produce a much louder response from everyone involved. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Proper condom use settled its censorship quietly, without press releases or public statements from either side. What came later in that same season of South Park did not settle quietly at all. A different episode, a different kind of pressure, and a controversy over a word said on a completely different television show altogether set the stage for one of the most precisely engineered pieces of satire the series ever produced. Section 3. It hits the fan. The word the network chose not to bleep television in the United States in the year 2001 operated under a set of rules that had not changed in any fundamental way for several decades. Broadcast networks, the ones sending their signal over the air and into homes without requiring a cable subscription or a satellite dish, were governed by Federal Communications Commission regulations that drew a specific and enforceable line around certain categories of language. Obscene, indecent, and profane content was prohibited during the hours when children were most likely to be watching, and the commission had the authority to levy fines against stations that crossed those lines. The word at the center of this section was one of the words the commission considered potentially indecent in broadcast contexts, meaning that a character on a network drama saying it without a bleep was not simply an editorial choice that the network made on its own. It carried regulatory risk. It could cost real money. Cable television operated differently. The cable networks were not bound by FCC indecency regulations in the same way that broadcast networks were, because they were not using the public airwaves. A cable subscriber had made a deliberate choice to subscribe, which the regulatory framework treated as a meaningful distinction between the two audiences. This difference had been building into an increasingly visible divide throughout the 1990s, as cable developed original programming that pushed into content broadcast could not touch, language it could not use, situations it could not show, and material it could not address without risking regulatory consequences. By 2001, the divide between what cable could air and what broadcast could air was wide enough to be obvious to anyone paying attention to both sides simultaneously. What made this particular year interesting is that a broadcast network had just crossed one of its own lines in a way that generated enormous public attention. The show was Chicago Hope, a long-running medical drama that had been airing on CBS since 1994. During one episode in 1999, a character played by actor Mark Harmon said the word shit on air, clearly, without a bleep, during primetime broadcast. This was not a character in crisis doing something extreme that the plot required. It was a brief, almost incidental moment, the kind of thing that might pass without notice in the context of a cable show or a film and would simply register as naturalistic dialogue. On CBS during primetime, in front of an audience accustomed to broadcast's long-standing standards around language, it became a story. The coverage that followed treated the moment as a genuine event. Critics and columnists debated what it meant for broadcast standards. The Parents Television Council, which was by then well established as a monitoring organization for primetime content, weighed in with objections. Industry observers discussed whether a line had been crossed or whether the line itself was overdue for revision. The FCC received complaints from viewers, which was itself part of how indecency enforcement worked at that point, with the commission relying heavily on public complaints to flag potential violations before making any formal determination. The discussion went on well past the original broadcast, cycling through the same arguments from different angles without producing any settled conclusion about what broadcast television was now going to allow or prohibit. Parker and Stone were watching all of this from the very different vantage point of a cable show that had already been using exactly that word casually, repeatedly, and without any apparent consequence for years. South Park had featured the word in its first episode and had continued using it throughout its run on Comedy Central without generating the kind of sustained coverage that a single use of it on CBS had produced. The gap between the two reactions was not subtle. A word that South Park had been saying as background noise since 1997 had just sparked a national conversation because a different kind of show on a different kind of network had said it once. Season 5 of South Park opened with an episode built entirely around this gap. The episode is called It Hits the Fan, and its title already signals what Parker and Stone intended. This was not an episode that would approach the Chicago Hope controversy from a cautious satirical distance, picking apart the overreaction through carefully layered commentary. The show decided to test the exact question the controversy had raised, not by arguing about it, but by performing an experiment inside the runtime of a single episode, using the most direct method available. The setup mirrors the Chicago Hope situation almost exactly. A fictional television drama within the South Park universe called Cop Drama airs an episode during which a character says the word shit, uncensored, on live television. The reaction that follows through the town of South Park copies the pattern of the real reaction to the Chicago Hope moment, with neighbors and public figures and news coverage treating the event event as something significant, something that has shifted the landscape of what is permitted. The town absorbs the moment, and then, because people tend to adjust their behavior to match what respected institutions appear to have sanctioned, begins saying the word themselves. What makes the episode different from a simple parody of the controversy is what Comedy Central agreed to allow alongside it. Every time the word appears in the episode, whether spoken by a character or displayed as text on screen, it is uncensored, completely uncensored. No bleep, no mute, no visual substitution. Comedy Central, a cable network with the regulatory freedom to make this choice, agreed to air an episode in which the word was said by characters in the South Park universe a total of 162 times across the runtime, with an additional 38 instances of the word appearing in written form on screen. The episode built a visible counter into its own presentation, tracking the cumulative total across the runtime so that the audience could watch the number climb in real time. This counter is one of the most interesting production choices in the episode's construction because it transforms something that might otherwise be experienced as casual repetition into something that requires the audience to pay active attention to scale. Most uses of extreme language in comedy rely on the element of surprise or emphasis to produce their effect. A word used 162 times inside 22 minutes cannot rely on surprise after the third or fourth instance. What the counter does is acknowledge this directly, taking the repetition that would normally be hidden inside casual dialogue and making it visible as a quantity, forcing the audience to sit with the cumulative weight of how many times a word can appear inside a single piece of television before it stops registering as a word at all. The question Comedy Central was answering by allowing the episode to air as intended was itself a significant one for the network. Allowing a single character to say the word once in a cable drama was a relatively modest step. Allowing a show to say it 162 times in one episode, with a visible counter tracking every instance, was a different kind of decision entirely, one that required someone at the network to look at what Parker and Stone had made and explicitly conclude that the entire project was worth defending as is. They made that conclusion. The episode aired without the bleeps that would have made it a very different piece of television, and the counter ran from the first instance to the last. Outside the United States, the episode's reception was considerably more restricted. International broadcasters who had been airing South Park under licensing agreements faced their own standards bodies and regulatory environments, and the word's uncensored repetition across the runtime created a problem for markets where even cable networks operated under stricter content rules. In several countries, the episode was either aired with the word bleeped throughout or was held back from broadcast entirely during the period when It Hits the Fan first ran. The episode that Comedy Central had chosen to air without restriction became, in those international contexts, an example of exactly the kind of censorship it was built around satirizing. The word bleeped back out, the counter either hidden or altered, the whole experiment disrupted by the broadcasting environment it was landing in. This international gap is worth sitting with because it reveals something about how completely the episode's meaning depended on its own uncensored presentation. An episode built around the argument that treating a single word as specially forbidden produces a reaction wildly out of proportion to any actual harm the word can cause does not work the same way when the word itself is bleeped out of the broadcast. A bleeped version of It Hits the Fan strips the experiment of its evidence. The counter still runs, but without the word itself being audible, the count becomes abstract rather than concrete, a number rising toward 162 without the audience actually hearing what is being counted. The episode that Parker and Stone made relied on Comedy Central's willingness to let the word land without obstruction. In markets where it was bleeped, a different episode effectively aired, one where the network blinked at the moment the show was asking it to hold still. What Comedy Central was doing by allowing the uncensored version to air was also something more specific than simply tolerating extreme language. The network was making a visible choice to stand on one side of the argument the episode was making. A bleep would have suggested that the network agreed the word required protection, that the reaction to its use was proportionate, that there was something about it that merited the kind of special handling that the episode was arguing against. By not bleeping it, Comedy Central was implicitly endorsing the show's position, which was that the entire controversy surrounding the word's use on Chicago Hope was a demonstration of how easily a moral panic could form around something carrying no real capacity for harm beyond the social agreement to treat it as forbidden. This alignment between network decision and show argument is unusual in South Park's censorship history. Most of the show's significant censorship cases involve a conflict between what Parker and Stone wanted to air and what the network or some outside force was willing to allow. It Hits the Fan moved in the opposite direction, with the network actively supporting the creator's most extreme choice rather than resisting it. The episode functions as a collaboration between the show and its network around a question about what cable television was going to be willing to do that broadcast television could not, and both sides appear to have decided that the answer in this particular case was 162 times, with a counter on screen. The aftermath of the episode was quieter than the Chicago Hope controversy that inspired it had been. The Parents Television Council objected, predictably, treating the 162 instances as evidence of exactly the kind of irresponsible content the organization had spent years warning parents about. The broader critical and public response was mixed in the way that most South Park responses were mixed, with some commentators praising the precision of the experiment and others arguing that the repetition was gratuitous regardless of the satirical frame. The FCC received no formal complaints capable of triggering any regulatory consequence, because Comedy Central as a cable network was outside the Commission's jurisdiction in this area. The regulatory protection that had made the word a significant event on CBS provided no leverage over what a cable show could do with it. The episode's lasting effect on South Park's own broadcast history was concrete in a specific way. After It Hits the Fan aired, the word became part of the show's accepted vocabulary on Comedy Central, used in subsequent episodes without requiring the same level of deliberate decision-making that the first season's 5th episode had once triggered. The experiment had demonstrated that the network could allow it, that audiences did not disappear in response, and that the regulatory consequences cable was not subject to anyway had no purchase on what Comedy Central chose to air. The word moved, in the vocabulary of the show's relationship with its network, from something that had once required a quiet internal deliberation into something that was simply part of how South Park talked. What this section of the show's censorship history reveals, when placed next to the fire scene cut from An Elephant Makes Love to a Pig and the post-broadcast demand applied to proper condom use, is that the early relationship between South Park and Comedy Central was far more active and negotiated than the show's reputation as an untouchable creative force sometimes suggests. The network cut the fire scene without public comment. It demanded changes to the Garrison demonstration after the episode had already aired. And then, in this third case, it went the other way entirely, choosing to stand behind an episode that repeated a word 162 times in a way that no broadcast network could have matched without risking significant regulatory consequences. 3 different outcomes, 3 different kinds of decisions, all made within the first 5 years of the show's existence, before the more famous and more dramatic censorship battles over religion and international politics had begun. The word that caused a national conversation when said once on Chicago Hope eventually became background noise on South Park, said so many times across the show's continuing run that nobody tracking its appearances has managed to produce a complete count. The experiment that It Hits the Fan ran in 2001 produced a clear result. Repetition alone does not produce harm, and the social agreement to treat a word as especially dangerous dissolves quickly once a trusted institution decides, visibly and without apology, that the word is simply a word. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Comedy Central standing behind a word said 162 times in one episode showed how much latitude the network was willing to give Parker and Stone on its own term. But that latitude had clear limits, and those limits became visible later the same year when a completely different kind of pressure arrived from outside the network entirely, aimed at an episode that had nothing to do with language and everything to do with one of the most protected institutions in the entertainment industry. Section 4. Trapped in the Closet. Closet Gate. By the fall of 2005, South Park was in its 9th season and had long since stopped being the kind of show that surprised anyone simply by existing. The controversy cycle had become familiar enough that most public objections to individual episodes ran their course within a news cycle or two, generating coverage, producing a statement or two from the relevant offended party, and then fading back into the general background noise of the show's ongoing reputation. Religious groups had objected, parent organizations had objected, individual public figures had objected. None of it had produced any lasting change in how the show operated or what it was willing to put on screen. Parker and Stone had, through 8 years of continuous operation, built something that appeared to be genuinely controversy resistant, able to absorb objection from almost any direction without structural consequence. Season 9 arrived with the confidence that kind of track record produces. The episodes were sharper and more deliberately constructed than much of what the show had been doing in its middle seasons, leaning into specific historical and cultural structures with more precision than the broader satirical swings of earlier years. Ginger Kids, which aired earlier in that same season, had built an entire movement around a physical trait using borrowed vocabulary from one of the darkest chapters in modern history. The show was operating at a level of intentionality that its most committed critics rarely gave it credit for, which made what came in the 12th episode of that season both entirely in keeping with the season's approach and genuinely surprising in the specific institution it chose to take on directly. The episode is called Trapped in the Closet, and it opens with Stan walking past a Scientology recruitment table on the street, where members of the organization are offering free personality tests to passers-by. Stan takes the test, not because he is curious about Scientology, but because he wants to know what the test is, the same casual curiosity that makes someone pick up a free brochure tour in an airport. When the results come back showing readings the test administrators have apparently never seen before, the situation changes quickly. The church members running the table believe Stan may be the reincarnation of L. Ron Hubbard, the man who founded the religion decades earlier. Word spreads through the organization faster than Stan can process what is happening to him. By the time he understands he has wandered into something much larger than a free questionnaire, he is being treated as a kind of prophet by people who are entirely serious about what they believe. The episode does something at this point that almost no other television show had attempted up to that moment. It stops its own plot, places a text card on screen stating that what follows is what Scientologists actually believe, and then walks the audience through the religion's origin story in full animated detail. The narrative involves an ancient galactic ruler named Xenu, hydrogen bombs detonated inside volcanoes billions of years ago, and the idea that human beings carry within them the trapped spirits of ancient alien beings whose suffering continues to affect people in the present. The show presents all of this without adding any layer of mockery beyond the act of presentation itself. No character makes a joke about it. The narration remains calm and descriptive throughout. The information is simply placed in front of the audience, illustrated in South Park's usual animation style, and allowed to sit there without commentary. This was a deliberate and considered choice rather than an easy joke, and the difference matters enormously when thinking about how the episode was built and what made it so threatening to the people it was describing. South Park had always had the option to exaggerate the beliefs it was satirizing, to make them sillier or more extreme than they actually were, in order to generate the reaction it wanted from its audience. Trapped in the Closet chose not to do that. The creative decision to present Scientology's actual internal teachings without embellishment meant the episode had no protective layer of fictional distortion between itself and its subject. Everything the episode said about the religion's origin story was, according to those teachings, accurate. The show was not inventing something ridiculous and attributing it to Scientology. It was presenting what Scientology had described about itself, and trusting that the presentation would do the work the writers wanted it to do. Tom Cruise arrives at Stan's house during the episode after word of Stan's test results has spread far enough to reach the celebrity members of the church. The character of Cruise, portrayed in South Park's usual style, with a cartoon version of the actor's face and a recognizable version of his general affect, comes seeking the approval of the newly identified reincarnation of Hubbard. When Stan, overwhelmed and uncomfortable with the attention he has received, gives Cruise a polite but dismissive assessment of his acting ability, Cruise takes it badly. He retreats into a closet inside Stan's bedroom and refuses to come out. Other characters arrive and ask him to come out of the closet. He refuses. The joke, which the episode commits to with the kind of total sincerity that makes South Park's best material work, never explains itself or winks at the audience. It simply runs. John Travolta, another prominent Scientologist, arrives and also ends up in the closet. Kelly, who is not a Scientologist but had a song of the same name, arrives and also ends up in the closet. The visual of multiple famous men crammed into a child's bedroom closet, refusing to emerge, carries exactly the layered meaning that anyone watching in 2005 would have read immediately, and the episode does nothing to soften or qualify it. The original broadcast aired on November 16, 2005 on Comedy Central. It generated coverage and discussion immediately. The satirical depiction of Scientology's teachings was the subject of considerable commentary, and the Tom Cruise material produced its own separate thread of reaction. The Catholic League's William Donahue, who had become one of South Park's most consistent outside critics, criticized the episode for the sequence where Jesus appears on screen during the same episode. His objection was specifically that the show would mock Scientology while Jesus appeared in the same episode, which he argued demonstrated a double standard, even though Jesus' appearance in the episode had nothing directly to do with Scientology or Tom Cruise. Parker and Stone, watching an outside critic defend the organization whose beliefs they had just presented plainly on screen, did not need to say anything in response. The irony spoke for itself. What happened several months later was quieter and considerably more complicated than anything the original broadcast had produced. Isaac Hayes had been part of South Park since the show's very first episode in 1997. His voice was Chef, the school cafeteria cook who gave the boys advice dressed in cooking metaphors, who had become in many ways the warmest and most consistent adult figure in the show's long-running cast. Hayes was a legendary recording artist with a career stretching back to the 1960s, best known to many audiences for composing the theme to the 1971 film Shaft, and his presence on South Park gave the show something that its satirical identity might otherwise have lacked: a performer of genuine stature and warmth who brought credibility to the project simply by choosing to be part of it. He was also a practicing member of the Church of Scientology. In the months after Trapped in the Closet aired, Hayes discussed the episode directly with Parker and Stone. The conversation was described at the time as having gone reasonably well. Hayes did not appear to be making any ultimatum or formal demand in the immediate aftermath. The situation looked, for a period, like the show had made a joke about something one of its most respected cast members held sacred. That cast member had said something about it privately, and the two sides had managed to reach some kind of equilibrium without anything breaking apart. Then, in March of 2006, an announcement came that Isaac Hayes was leaving the show. A statement attributed to Hayes cited his discomfort with South Park's treatment of religion as the reason, describing the show's willingness to mock religious beliefs as crossing a line he could no longer accept. The departure generated significant press coverage immediately. The story had obvious shape and obvious drama. A legendary performer, devoted to his faith, had decided he could no longer remain part of a show that mocked something he held sacred. It was the kind of principled exit that made for clean headlines, and the clean headline version of the story spread quickly. 4 days after Hayes' departure became public, Comedy Central pulled a scheduled rerun of Trapped in the Closet from its March 15, 2006 broadcast lineup and replaced it with an older episode called Chef's Chocolate Salty Balls. No public explanation accompanied the change. The episode simply was not in the slot where it had been scheduled, and something else was playing instead. Comedy Central's official statement, when pressed, described the schedule change as a tribute to Isaac Hayes following his departure from the show, a way of honoring the actor by airing one of his most beloved episodes rather than the episode that had generated the conflict surrounding his exit. This explanation did not survive much contact with what people in the industry were saying at the time. Reports from multiple sources, including an account from the New York Post that attributed the information to insiders with knowledge of the situation, suggested that Tom Cruise had been the actual force behind the rerun's disappearance. According to those reports, Cruise had communicated to Viacom, the parent company of Comedy Central, that he would refuse to participate in promotional activities for Mission Impossible 3 if the rerun of Trapped in the Closet was allowed to air as scheduled. Mission Impossible 3 was a Paramount Pictures production, and Paramount was also owned by Viacom, which meant that the corporate parent of the network airing South Park was simultaneously the studio banking on Cruise's cooperation for one of its most anticipated summer releases. Cruise's representative denied that he had asked for anything. Comedy Central and Paramount both declined to confirm the reports. The official line remained that the schedule change was about honoring Isaac Hayes, not about placating anyone associated with the episode's other major target. Parker and Stone responded to the situation in a way that made their own reading of events perfectly clear without directly confirming the specifics. Their public statement, released through their attorney and described as coming from the servants of the Dark Lord Xenu, announced that Scientology had won this particular battle, but that the million-year war for Earth had just begun. The statement took no position on which version of events the network was offering. It simply acknowledged, in character and without apology, that something significant had just happened. The Los Angeles Times named the controversy Closetgate, attaching the political scandal suffix that had become shorthand for any entertainment or public affairs incident treated with more gravity than a routine scheduling change. The name stuck because the situation had the essential shape that earned it, a decision that was obviously one thing being officially described as another thing, with the real explanation floating around in industry conversations while the public record insisted on the less interesting version. Cruise and his representatives denied any involvement. The network maintained the tribute narrative. The people who knew what had actually happened were not the people whose versions were getting into print. What the Closetgate controversy ultimately revealed about Comedy Central's relationship with its most successful show was a limit that had not previously been visible. The fire scene had been cut quietly in the first season. The Garrison demonstration had been pulled back after broadcast. The network had stood behind It Hits the Fan without blinking. In each of those cases, the decision was made inside the network's own walls without reference to the corporate relationships of its parent company. Trapped in the Closet introduced a different kind of pressure, one that did not come from a public interest organization or a regulatory body or an audience complaint. It came from a corporate relationship between Viacom and a performer whose cooperation was worth enough money to weigh against the cost of telling a cable show it could not air one of its own episodes in a rerun slot. Parker and Stone had been warned not to comment on the situation directly, reportedly told by people connected to the show that making further public statements would embarrass Cruise in a way that could create additional consequences. They complied with the silence requested of them, a compliance that was itself unusual enough that the restraint became part of the story. The servants of the Dark Lord Xenu had, for the moment, run out of public statements to make. The full story of Isaac Hayes' departure took years longer to become clear. His son, Isaac Hayes III, speaking in a 2016 Hollywood Reporter oral history of the show, revealed that his father had suffered a stroke in January of 2006, before the departure statement had been issued. The statement describing Hayes' principled exit from the show, according to his son, had been prepared and released by people around Hayes during a period when the actor himself was not in a condition to be the one making such decisions. The clean narrative of a devoted Scientologist walking away from a job in protest was built, according to this account, on a statement issued in a vulnerable man's name without his full awareness or consent. The episode that had produced this entire sequence of events was nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award in July of 2006 in the category for Outstanding Animated Program. The same episode that Comedy Central had quietly removed from a rerun slot 4 months earlier. The same episode whose existence had apparently cost Chef his place on the show was being formally recognized by the Television Academy as one of the best pieces of animated television produced that year. It was the kind of outcome that requires no further editorial comment to make its own point. Trapped in the Closet did return to Comedy Central's broadcast rotation after the immediate controversy cooled. It is available today on Paramount+. The rerun that was pulled on March 15, 2006 turned out not to be a permanent removal, but a temporary one. The kind of quiet institutional accommodation that resolves itself once the specific corporate pressure driving it has passed. The episode's content was never altered. Nothing in the Scientology material was changed. The Tom Cruise joke remains exactly as it originally aired. The only lasting casualty of the entire situation was Chef, who was written off the show at the start of season 10 and never returned. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. ClosetGate showed what happened when corporate relationships inside a parent company became relevant to what a cable show could air in a rerun slot. The next major censorship event in South Park's history operated through a completely different kind of institution, one with no financial relationship to Viacom at all, and the pressure it applied produced a controversy that spread internationally before the episode had even finished its first week on the air. Section 5. Bloody Mary, the boycott that built an audience. 3 weeks after Trapped in the Closet aired in November of 2005, South Park put out another episode that would generate its own separate religious controversy, one running simultaneously with the Scientology backlash and involving a completely different institution, a completely different country, and an outcome that nobody organizing the opposition had intended or predicted. The two controversies overlapping inside the same season of the same show created a period in late 2005 and early 2006 that was, by any measure, the most concentrated sequence of external pressure the series had faced in its 8 years on the air. What made it stranger still was that the second controversy, the one involving the Catholic Church, produced results almost perfectly opposite to what everyone applying pressure had been trying to achieve. The episode is called Bloody Mary, and it aired on December 7, 2005, which is the evening before the Feast of the Immaculate Conception on the Catholic liturgical calendar. Whether this timing was a deliberate choice by Parker and Stone, or a coincidence generated by the production schedule, is not something the creators addressed publicly in any detail. The date is specific enough that coincidence seems unlikely, but the show operated on a production timeline fast enough and chaotic enough that deliberate placement of a specific episode on a specific culturally significant date was not always a realistic option. The timing, whatever its origin, would become part of how the controversy was described by the organizations taking offense. Randy Marsh is the episode's center, which was itself something of a shift from the show's usual 4th grade classroom perspective. Randy has been drinking heavily, a habit that the episode presents as having moved well past the social drinking stage into something his family can no longer ignore. After a drunk driving incident, Randy is ordered to attend meetings of an Alcoholics Anonymous-style recovery program, and he throws himself into the program's model of powerlessness with an enthusiasm that the episode treats as its own kind of addiction. Randy becomes convinced that his drinking is a disease over which he has no control whatsoever, and he uses this conviction to absolve himself of any responsibility for changing his behavior, leaning on the disease framework as a reason to keep drinking rather than a reason to stop. Running alongside Randy's story is the episode's central event. A statue of the Virgin Mary in a neighboring town has begun bleeding from a specific location on its body, a detail the episode specifies in terms that anyone paying attention would recognize immediately. The bleeding is initially interpreted as a miracle. Crowds gather, news coverage arrives, people in the surrounding area make pilgrimages to see the statue and pray before it. The town becomes a site of active religious observance, with believers treating the blood as confirmation of the divine presence in an ordinary object. Randy, still committed to his disease framework, travels to see the statue in the hope that the miraculous blood will cure him of his alcoholism. Pope Benedict XVI eventually appears at the site, drawn by the reports of a possible miracle. After examining the statue, the Pope delivers his official determination. The statue is not performing a miracle. The location and nature of the bleeding, he concludes, is a physical phenomenon rather than a divine one, and the appropriate response is not veneration, but simple acknowledgement that statues, apparently, do what they do. The crowd's reaction to this determination, and Randy's eventual response to the collapse of his disease framework, carries the episode's satirical point about the relationship between personal responsibility and the frameworks people use to avoid it. The Catholic League for Religious and Civil Rights responded to the the episode with a statement that described it as one of the most appalling and disgusting portrayals of a religious figure the organization had encountered in its history of monitoring American television. The League, led by its president William Donahue, demanded a public apology from Comedy Central and called specifically for the episode to be permanently retired from any future distribution, including any DVD release of the season in which it appeared. This demand went further than most censorship requests aimed at the show, extending past the usual request to pull the episode from reruns into a demand that it be treated as something that had no place in any permanent record of the series at all. The demand for a DVD retirement was notable for how it mapped out the Catholic League's understanding of what permanent censorship actually required in an era when physical media had become the main way audiences accessed older content. Pulling an episode from broadcast reruns had become almost routine as a network response to organized pressure, and several episodes of South Park had received exactly that treatment at various points. But a rerun pull did not prevent an episode from appearing on a season box set where it would be available indefinitely to anyone willing to buy the physical release. The Catholic League's demand recognized this limitation and tried to close it, arguing that the episode should be unavailable in any format rather than simply unavailable in the broadcast rotation. Comedy Central did not meet this demand. Bloody Mary appears on the South Park Season 9 DVD set and has remained available in various formats throughout the years since the controversy. The permanent retirement the Catholic League requested never happened. What did happen was considerably more limited. When Comedy Central re-aired all of Season 9's episodes on December 28, 2005, as a year-end block, Bloody Mary was absent from the broadcast. Every other episode from the season was included. The specific episode that had generated the Catholic League's response was simply not in the lineup, replaced by other programming without any public explanation offered for its absence. This was the same approach the network had used when Trapped in the Closet's rerun had been pulled a few months earlier, a quiet omission with no accompanying statement about what had caused it. Joseph A. Califano Jr., a member of Viacom's board of directors and a practicing Catholic, released a statement describing the episode as appalling and disgusting and pledging to have it reviewed by Viacom's president and chief executive Tom Freston. Bishop William Skylestad, who served as president of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops at that time, sent a formal letter to Freston expressing what he described as extreme insensitivity on the network's part in airing the episode. The involvement of a sitting Viacom board member and the head of the National Catholic Bishops Organization gave the Catholic League's campaign a weight that most external objections to South Park had never achieved, connecting the pressure directly to people who had actual corporate standing rather than simply being external critics with no institutional access to the network's decision-making process. The episode returned to the broadcast rotation on August 2, 2006, roughly 8 months after the December 28th omission, without any formal announcement or public ceremony around its reappearance. The period of its absence from the schedule was long enough to suggest that the network had been weighing how to handle the competing pressures from the Catholic League and the show's own creators, and short enough to suggest that Comedy Central had ultimately decided the episode belonged in the rotation regardless of what outside organizations wanted done with it. Like Trapped in the Closet, Bloody Mary was temporarily rather than permanently removed from South Park's official broadcast history, surviving its controversy without being permanently altered or retired. What happened outside the United States with this episode tells a considerably more complicated story, one where the network's institutional resistance to pressure produced an outcome nobody leading the campaign had intended, and where the specific cultural and regulatory environment of a country on the other side of the world turned a religious organization's demand into one of the highest-rated cable broadcasts in that country's recent history. New Zealand was where the most concentrated external campaign against Bloody Mary ended up running, and where it produced results that have since become a standard example of what is sometimes called the Streisand effect, the phenomenon where an attempt to suppress or censor a piece of content draws far more attention to it than it would have received if left alone. The episode was scheduled to air on C4, a youth-oriented music channel operated by the CanWest TV Works Media Group, in February of 2006. Before the broadcast, leaders from New Zealand's Catholic Bishops' Conference, joined by representatives of the Council of Christians and Muslims and other religious groups, formally lobbied CanWest to cancel the planned airing. They sent letters, made public statements, and organized their members around the effort to prevent the episode from reaching a New Zealand audience. CanWest rejected the request. The network said the episode would air as planned. In response, New Zealand's Roman Catholic bishops issued a letter that was read at Sunday masses across the country and published in print outlets, calling the episode ugly and tasteless and urging Catholics to boycott the C4 channel and its parent network TV3, along with the advertisers whose money supported both. New Zealand's Prime Minister Helen Clark issued a public statement describing describing the episode as sounding revolting, while simultaneously confirming that the network was legally free to air it. A separate company named C4 Productions, which had no connection to the music channel but shared its name, sought a court injunction to prevent the broadcast on the grounds that people would confuse the two organizations and damage the production company's reputation. A judge rejected the application the evening before the scheduled broadcast. At this point, CanWest made a decision that, in hindsight, transformed the situation from a religious controversy into a broadcasting case study. Rather than holding to the original schedule, the network moved the broadcast forward, airing the episode sooner than planned, specifically in order to capitalize on the attention the boycott campaign had generated. The thinking was straightforward. The campaign had created a level of public interest in the episode far exceeding anything a normal broadcast would have attracted, and waiting would mean letting that interest cool before the episode actually aired. The episode drew an audience of 210,000 viewers on the night it aired, according to figures released by CanWest Chief Operating Officer Rick Friesen. A normal South Park episode on that channel attracted roughly 32,500 viewers. The boycott had produced an audience more than 6 times the show's regular viewership, with more than 350 people gathering outside the CanWest headquarters in Auckland to protest while the broadcast aired inside. The protest, the counter-audience it sent toward the channel, and the bishop's letter read, "At Sunday Masses," had together accomplished exactly the opposite of what the Catholic Church's New Zealand leadership had been trying to achieve. The Broadcasting Standards Authority of New Zealand received complaints about the broadcast from dozens of individuals and organizations, including a formal challenge from the Catholic bishops. In June of 2006, the authority rejected all of the complaints. Its ruling concluded that the episode had not breached broadcasting standards, describing its depiction of religious icons and rituals as farcical and absurd, rather than constituting the kind of vicious attack on religious belief that would have warranted regulatory action. The ruling specifically noted that showing disrespect for a religious tradition did not automatically rise to the level of denigration that broadcasting standards were designed to prevent. New Zealand's Catholic bishops announced they would appeal the decision, taking the complaint to the High Court in Wellington, where the bishops' lawyers argued the episode was tasteless, crass, and ugly. The Broadcasting Standards Authority's original decision was upheld. Australia presented a slightly different version of the same story. The national broadcaster SBS had planned to air the episode, but postponed the broadcast, not primarily because of the Catholic League campaign or the New Zealand controversy, but because of the timing of a separate and much larger international crisis. The Gillen's Poston Muhammad cartoons controversy had been generating violent protests across multiple countries in early 2006, and SBS's programming director appears to have made a judgment that airing a South Park episode involving religious imagery at that specific moment carried risks beyond the normal threshold for controversial content. The postponement was driven less by organized pressure against Bloody Mary specifically, and more by the broader climate around religious satire in that particular window of time. Bloody Mary remains available on Paramount Plus today. Its TVMA rating was retained even during the period when Comedy Central downgraded many earlier South Park episodes to a less restrictive classification, making it one of the handful of specific episodes the network treated as warranting the most restrictive rating regardless of how the rest of the catalog was being reclassified. The Catholic League's demand that it be permanently retired from any format has not been met in the nearly 2 decades since the demand was made. The episode exists in full, unaltered, in the same form it aired on December 7, 2005, available to anyone with a streaming subscription. What the Bloody Mary controversy revealed about the specific mechanics of organized religious pressure against South Park was something the show's own critics had perhaps not fully absorbed from earlier controversies. A campaign that generates enough attention to reach a national prime minister, a Viacom board member, the president of a national conference of bishops, and the primetime news cycle of a country 7,000 miles away can still fail entirely to produce the censorship it is organized around achieving, and in the process of failing, can produce exactly the opposite result, a level of public attention that turns an episode into an event. The 210,000 New Zealanders who watched Bloody Mary on the night it aired were not a South Park audience that had been there before the campaign. They were an audience the campaign had built. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The New Zealand boycott produced an audience 6 times larger than the episode would have drawn without it, which is its own kind of argument about how censorship campaigns function when the content they are targeting is already widely available. The next episode in this history was not widely available at all, and its disappearance from every streaming platform happened not because of anything that occurred after it aired, but because of something that happened 9 years before anyone thought to remove it. Section 6. Super Best Friends. 9 years without a complaint. Summer of 2001 in American television was not a moment anyone was thinking carefully about the specific sensitivities surrounding depictions of the Islamic prophet Muhammad. The Gillen's Poston cartoon cartoons were 4 years away. The international protests they would trigger, the riots, the deaths, the entire restructuring of how Western media thought about visual representations of a religious figure had not happened yet and could not have been predicted with any confidence by anyone working in a cable animation studio in Los Angeles. The cultural landscape around that particular subject was simply different in the summer of 2001 than it would be by the summer of 2006, and the difference between those two moments is the entire explanation for what happened to an episode called Super Best Friends, which aired without incident during the first period and was pulled from every streaming platform during the second. South Park had been depicting religious figures since its earliest episodes. Jesus Christ had been a recurring presence in the show since its very first season, appearing as a character who hosted a public access television program in South Park and who interacted with the four boys and the town's other residents in ways that ranged from affectionate to genuinely uncomfortable. Buddha had appeared. Moses had appeared in the form of a floating geometric shape that spoke in an enormous voice. The show's relationship with religious iconography was, by 2001, well established enough that placing religious figures in comedic situations was simply part of what South Park did, alongside everything else it did, without requiring any special justification or surrounding explanation. The episode that would become the most unusual censorship case in the show's history aired on July 4th, 2001, the 4th of July, which is Independence Day in the United States. The date gave the episode a slightly different feel to its original broadcast, airing into an audience that was in a holiday frame of mind rather than the usual weeknight viewing rhythm. Whether the date was chosen deliberately or simply reflected where the episode fell in the production schedule is not something Parker and Stone addressed in any detail. It aired when it aired, and for the purposes of what followed, the date matters mainly because it is specific and verifiable. July 4th, 2001 is when the image that would later become impossible to show on any streaming platform was first shown on Comedy Central without any censorship of any kind, to an audience that received it without generating any organized response whatsoever. The episode's premise is built around David Blaine, who in 2001 was at the peak of a particular phase of his public career as a street magician. Blaine had become famous in the late 1990s for performing close-up magic directly in front of members of the public, capturing their reactions on camera in a way that felt genuinely different from the theatrical stage magic that had preceded it. By 2001, he had moved into longer endurance stunts, spending extended periods inside blocks of ice or suspended in various uncomfortable configurations, and his public profile was high enough that his name carried immediate recognition across the kind of broad audience South Park was reaching. The episode uses his reputation to build a straightforward cult premise. Blaine arrives in South Park performing his street magic, and the residents of the town, including several of the main adult characters, become enchanted enough by his demonstrations to follow him into a religious movement that quickly turns dangerous. Stan watches his parents and other adults around him become increasingly absorbed in Blaine's cult, and eventually seeks help from Jesus Christ, who has his public access program, but is treated by the show's universe as a real and accessible figure rather than a theological abstraction. Jesus concludes that the situation requires more than he can handle alone, and calls in the Super Best Friends, a team of religious figures assembled specifically to deal with threats too large for any single religion's founder to address independently. The Super Best Friends that assemble in response to Jesus' call include Buddha, who can duplicate himself; Moses, in the floating geometric form the show had established in earlier episodes; Joseph Smith, who can make people glow; Krishna, who can transform into other beings; Lao Tzu, who possesses super wisdom; and a character named Seaman, whose name the show's other characters keep mispronouncing for a joke that runs through the episode. Muhammad joins the team as well, depicted in a yellow robe, orange turban, and dark facial hair, possessing the power of pyrokinesis, the ability to generate and control fire. Muhammad's specific power in the episode is fire, which the show uses in a way that fits naturally into the team's action sequences. He is one member of an ensemble, given roughly the same weight and attention as the other Super Best Friends, participating in the group's effort to stop Blaine and his followers from causing mass harm. He is drawn in the same animation style as every other character in the episode, depicted with the same level of visual specificity that the show applied to Jesus or Buddha or any other figure in the same episode, and he speaks lines of dialogue in the same way that other members of the team speak theirs. Nothing about his depiction is presented as requiring special handling. The episode treats him as it treats everyone else in the same scene, which is to say, it treats him as a character in a cartoon. The reaction to this depiction, upon the episode's original airing and in its subsequent reruns across the following years, was essentially nothing. The Catholic League, which had already established itself as a consistent critic of South Park's treatment of Jesus and Christian imagery, did not issue a statement about Muhammad's appearance in this episode. No Muslim advocacy organization issued a formal response. No government or regulatory body filed any complaint. The episode ran through its initial broadcast cast, returned in reruns, appeared in rotation as a normal part of the show's catalog, and was treated by every institution that monitored South Park's content as an unremarkable entry in a show with a long history of depicting religious figures in comic situations. This is not because nobody was watching. South Park was drawing millions of viewers per episode by 2001 and had been the subject of sustained criticism from parent organizations, religious groups, and government officials across its first 4 seasons. The Parents Television Council was active and well-funded in 2001. William Donahue of the Catholic League had already issued multiple statements about the show's treatment of religious content. The infrastructure for organized objection to South Park's religious satire was fully in place when Super Best Friends aired. The absence of any organized response to Muhammad's appearance in the episode was not a result of nobody seeing it. It was a result of nobody, in the cultural moment of July 2001, treating a cartoon depiction of Muhammad as something that required a response. Trey Parker later described learning about the Jylans Poston controversy in 2005 while on his honeymoon, turning on the television in a hotel room and seeing coverage of thousands of protesters reacting to cartoons depicting the same figure who had appeared in Super Best Friends 4 years earlier without incident. His account, shared in interviews over the years, describes a moment of genuine disorientation. The same image that had aired on his show without generating any meaningful reaction was now at the center of an international crisis involving riots, deaths, and violent threats against the cartoonists and newspapers involved. Nothing about what South Park had shown had changed. Everything about how the world treated the showing of it had. The Jylans Poston controversy did not immediately cause Super Best Friends to disappear from the broadcast rotation. The episode continued to air in reruns through 2005 and into 2006, even as the Danish cartoons crisis was at its most intense internationally. Parker and Stone built the Cartoon Wars 2-parter in season 10, specifically around the question the Jylans Poston situation had raised, whether the threat of violent reaction should determine what a television network was allowed to show. In those episodes, the show's own history with Muhammad was referenced directly, with the Super Best Friends appearance cited as evidence that the image had once been shown without consequence. The implication was clear. The image itself had not become more extreme or more deliberately provocative in the years between 2001 and 2006. The world around it had moved, and the image had been caught in that movement without changing. Cartoon Wars aired in 2006, with Comedy Central refusing to show Muhammad in the new episodes, inserting a black screen at the moment the character would have appeared. This decision, which Parker and Stone were publicly critical of, did not at that point extend to Super Best Friends itself. The episode remained technically available in the show's catalog, even as the network was refusing to depict Muhammad in new content. The distinction between what had been shown before the Jylans Poston controversy and what could be shown afterward was being held, for the time being, at the border between old and new content, with the retroactive removal of the 2001 episode not yet being treated as necessary. That changed in 2010, following the threats issued against Parker and Stone in the week between the broadcast of 200 and the broadcast of 201. The threats, which came from an organization called Revolution Muslim and included physical addresses for Comedy Central's offices, alongside a reference to the murder of Dutch filmmaker Theo van Gogh, produced a response from the network that extended well beyond the episodes directly involved in the controversy. Comedy Central's decision to heavily censor 201 and subsequently pull both 200 and 201 from the broadcast rotation and all streaming platforms was accompanied by a simultaneous decision about Super Best Friends. The episode that had aired without controversy in 2001 would also be removed from circulation. The reasoning behind the retroactive removal was connected to the same logic that had driven the censorship of the new episodes. Once the threats had established that showing Muhammad in any context carried a specific and credibly stated risk of violence against the people making and distributing the show, the network appears to have concluded that maintaining a freely accessible 9-year-old episode with an uncensored depiction of the same figure was no longer a defensible position, regardless of when that episode had been made or how different the cultural context of its original production had been. Super Best Friends was pulled from the South Park Studios website, removed from Hulu, and later excluded from the HBO Max deal that brought the show's catalog to streaming in 2019. It has not been made available on Paramount+. The episode appears on the Season 5 DVD and Blu-ray box sets in a form that includes the original depiction. Physical media preserves what streaming has removed, which means the episode is not entirely inaccessible in the way that 200 and 201 are technically inaccessible, but its availability through official digital channels is the same as the most heavily restricted content in the show's catalog: none. What the retroactive removal of Super Best Friends reveals is something about how censorship decisions interact with time in ways that more immediate responses to controversy do not raise. The episode was not censored in 2001 because nothing about 2001 2001 made its censorship necessary or conceivable. It was censored in 2010 because something that happened in 2010 retroactively changed the risk calculation attached to content produced 9 years earlier. The image in the episode did not change. The intentions behind the episode did not change. The creative choices Parker and Stone made in building the super best friends premise did not change. What changed was the demonstrable willingness of an outside group to threaten violence in response to a depiction of Muhammad, and that change applied backward through time to content that had predated it by nearly a decade. This is a different shape of censorship than any of the cases covered so far. The fire scene in An Elephant Makes Love to a Pig was cut before anyone had complained. The Garrison demonstration in proper condom use was shortened after a single airing. Trapped in the Closet was pulled from a rerun slot under corporate pressure. Bloody Mary was omitted from a rerun block before returning to rotation. All of those cases involved decisions made close in time to the content that triggered them, responding to specific and immediate pressures with specific and immediate actions. Super Best Friends was removed from circulation 9 years after it aired, in response to events that had nothing directly to do with the episode itself, because the world had moved far enough from where it had been in 2001 that the network concluded a freely streaming, uncensored depiction of Muhammad, regardless of how old or how innocent its origins were, could no longer be defended. The episode that David Blaine helped make possible by being famous at exactly the right moment for Parker and Stone to build a cult around him, currently occupies a category that very few pieces of television history occupy, simultaneously well-documented, widely discussed, and officially inaccessible through every legal streaming channel that exists. Anyone who wants to see it through official means needs a DVD player and a Season 5 box set. Anyone who watched it in a rerun before 2010 carries a memory of an episode that the show's official digital presence has since erased entirely. The Super Best Friends themselves, in the logic of the South Park universe, were assembled to stop threats that no individual could handle alone. The threat that eventually removed their episode from circulation was handled by neither the show nor the network alone, but by a decision made in the aftermath of violence others had promised and history had already carried out elsewhere. The fire that Muhammad had been given as a superpower in 2001 turned out, 9 years later, to be exactly the kind of image that the world would no longer allow a streaming platform to host without reservation. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Super Best Friends was pulled because of threats connected to episodes that had not yet aired when it was made. Those episodes, Cartoon Wars Parts 1 and 2, were themselves built around the exact question that pulling Super Best Friends would eventually answer: whether the threat of violence should determine what a network puts on screen. Comedy Central answered that question one way inside the fiction and a different way in reality. Section 7. Cartoon Wars. Comedy Central writes itself into the episode. The Jillen's Postin' Muhammad cartoons controversy had been running for several months by the time Parker and Stone sat down to write what would become the 3rd and 4th episodes of South Park's 10th season. The Danish newspaper had published its cartoons in September of 2005. By early 2006, the protests that followed their reprinting in outlets across Europe had turned violent in multiple countries, with embassies targeted, people killed in riots, and the cartoonists and editors involved in the original publication living under various levels of security protection. The story had moved well past the initial publication and was now about something larger, a global argument over whether the threat of violent reaction from part of an audience should function as a veto over what journalism, art, and satire could depict. Parker and Stone were watching this argument unfold from inside a show that had already depicted Muhammad once, 9 years earlier in Super Best Friends, without generating any reaction at all. The gap between that 2001 non-event and the international crisis unfolding around the Danish cartoons was not a gap in what had been drawn or what had been published. It was a gap in what the surrounding world was prepared to treat as an act requiring a response. The show had already been inside this subject before the subject had become dangerous, which gave Parker and Stone a specific kind of perspective on it that most other television programs did not share. They decided to make that perspective the explicit subject of 2 full episodes. The Cartoon Wars 2-parter, which aired on April 5th and April 12th, 2006, is built around a fictional version of exactly the situation the Jillen's Postin' controversy had created. A competing animated show within the South Park universe, Family Guy, announces that it will air an episode featuring an uncensored depiction of Muhammad. The town of South Park responds with immediate total panic. Windows are boarded, supplies are stockpiled, adults behave as though a natural disaster is approaching rather than a television broadcast, and the show plays this collective fear at maximum volume, stretching every behavior the town exhibits into something that mirrors the proportions of the real international reaction the Danish cartoons had produced. The central tension of the 2-parter is generated by the conflict between Kyle and Cartman, who take opposite positions on whether the Family Guy episode should be allowed to air. Kyle's argument argument is built around consistency. If a show is allowed to mock and satirize some groups, it must be allowed to mock all groups equally, because a system where some groups are protected from satire based on the severity of their likely reaction rewards the most threatening behavior and punishes everyone who stays reasonable. Cartman's stated position is that the episode must be pulled out of respect for Muslim viewers who would find the depiction offensive. His actual motivation, which the episode makes no effort to hide for long, is that he simply wants Family Guy canceled entirely because he finds it unfunny, and he is using the language of religious sensitivity as a convenient tool toward that separate end. This distinction between Kyle and Cartman gives the two episodes their satirical engine. The Gillen's-Poston controversy had produced a wide range of public reactions, some from people who were genuinely afraid of what publishing Muhammad's image might cause, and others from people who were using the controversy as an opportunity to advance positions they had held before the Danish cartoons existed. By placing both motivations inside the same story, the show made visible what the real-world coverage rarely examined directly, that a moral panic typically contains a mixture of sincere fear and tactical opportunism, running alongside each other in proportions that outside observers rarely bother to separate. Parker and Stone had been negotiating with Comedy Central about the two-parter since well before the episodes went into production. Their intention was to depict Muhammad within the episodes, something they believed was consistent with the show's stated philosophy of equal treatment across all religious subjects and its own precedent from Super Best Friends 5 years earlier. Comedy Central's position, as Parker and Stone later described it in various interviews and in the DVD commentary for season 10, was that showing Muhammad in the current climate was something the network was not willing to allow. The negotiations continued through the production process, with the network and the creators at an impasse that neither side was fully resolving. The fact that Cartoon Wars is a two-parter rather than a single episode is itself a product of this negotiation. According to the DVD commentary, Parker and Stone extended the story into a second episode specifically to keep the discussion with Comedy Central open as long as possible, buying themselves time to continue arguing for their intended version of the episodes before the broadcast deadline forced a final decision. The cliffhanger structure that sends Part 1 into Part 2 with the central question unresolved was not purely a creative choice about how to tell the story. It was also a tactical choice about how long to maintain the argument with the network about what the story would contain. Part 1 ends with an in-episode moment that made the negotiation itself part of the broadcast. As the first episode concludes, a narrator's voice asks, directly, whether Comedy Central will give in. The phrasing the episode uses is considerably more colorful than that neutral summary, but the question is explicit. Will the network allow the image that the story has been building toward, or will it fold under pressure? Placing this question inside the episode rather than in a press release or a public statement was a choice that put Comedy Central's editorial decision on display in front of the show's audience before the decision had been made. Anyone watching Part 1 knew, going into Part 2, that the show's creators and the network were actively disagreeing about the episode's content, and that the second episode's resolution would tell them which side had won. Comedy Central did not give in. The climactic moment in Part 2, where the fictional Family Guy episode finally airs its depiction of Muhammad within the world of the show, was replaced in broadcast by a black screen carrying a text message that said, plainly, that Comedy Central had refused to air an image of Muhammad. The text stayed on screen for a specific number of seconds before the episode continued, making the network's refusal visible as a fact, rather than allowing it to be hidden inside a creative workaround. There was no attempt to disguise what had happened with a clever in-universe explanation. The network had been unwilling to show the image, and the episode's broadcast told its audience exactly that. What followed the black screen in the episode was not a return to the main storyline. Parker and Stone had built a response to the network's refusal directly into the episode's structure, placing after the censored moment an uncensored depiction of Jesus Christ defecating on President George W. Bush and the American flag. The Jesus sequence aired without any network interference, without any black screen, without any text explaining that Comedy Central had found the content acceptable. The juxtaposition was the entire argument. A network that had refused to show a single image of Muhammad had simultaneously allowed an image of Jesus behaving in a way that would have drawn immediate and organized objection from the Catholic League if applied to any other religious figure. The double standard was not described or analyzed in dialogue. It was simply demonstrated, placed directly after the censored moment, letting the audience draw their own conclusions about what consistency actually looked like in practice. William Donahue of the Catholic League responded to the Jesus sequence by publicly describing Parker and Stone using language that was considerably more personal than his organization's usual formal statements. His characterization of the two creators, which he delivered to the Associated Press, expressed contempt rather than organized institutional objection, treating the episode as evidence of a specific kind of hypocrisy rather than a general offense against religion. The Catholic League had spent spent years objecting to South Park's treatment of Christian imagery. Here was an episode where the treatment of Christian imagery was, by any reading, secondary to a much larger argument about Muhammad, and Donahue's response missed the structure of what the episode was building entirely, focusing on the Jesus content, while the show's actual point was sitting in the black screen that had preceded it. The DVD commentary Parker and Stone recorded for Season 10 described their feelings about the network's refusal with a mixture of genuine frustration and some reluctant acknowledgement of the network's position. They were angry about the censorship. They believed Comedy Central had applied a standard to Muhammad that it would not have applied to any other religious subject. They also acknowledged, with less comfort than the frustration expressed about the decision, that the Gilans Poston controversy had already demonstrated that depicting Muhammad carried risks for real people that depicting Jesus or Buddha or Moses did not carry in the same way at that particular moment in history. The acknowledgement did not settle the argument or make the network's decision feel right to them. It simply existed alongside the frustration, a recognition that the situation they were navigating was genuinely more complicated than their stated philosophy of equal treatment fully accounted for. The episode's status in the years since their original broadcast has been more complicated than any of the other censored entries in this history. For a period, Cartoon Wars Part 1 and Part 2 remained accessible on the South Park Studios website even after they had been excluded from the HBO Max streaming deal in 2019 and from the Paramount Plus transition that followed. This partial availability, where the episodes could not be found on major streaming platforms but had not been entirely removed from the show's own digital presence, placed them in a different category than Super Best Friends, which was pulled from the South Park Studios site entirely. The technical status of the episodes across different platforms has shifted across different points in the streaming era, with different sources reporting different levels of availability at different times, making a single clean statement about where they currently sit in the official catalog difficult to nail down with complete certainty. What the two-parter accomplished within the show's creative history goes beyond its status as a censored entry in the catalog. Cartoon Wars is the first time Parker and Stone built their own censorship directly into the text of an episode, making the network's refusal part of the broadcast rather than something that happened behind it. The black screen was not simply a gap where the image would have been. It was a statement, dressed in Comedy Central's own text, placed inside an episode that had been arguing for 40 minutes that exactly this kind of statement should not be necessary. The show had found a way to demonstrate the censorship rather than simply experience it, turning the network's intervention into evidence for the episode's own argument. That structural choice would become a template for how Parker and Stone handled network interference going forward. When a decision was made about their content that they disagreed with, the disagreement became material rather than simply a grievance kept between the creators and the network. The audience was made part of the negotiation, shown what had happened, and allowed to evaluate the decision for themselves. Comedy Central had refused to broadcast an image of Muhammad, and the episode made sure everyone watching knew it, in those exact words, at the moment when knowing it mattered most. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Cartoon Wars made the network's censorship visible to everyone watching. 4 years later, the same question returned, under circumstances far more serious than anything 2006 had produced, and this time, the censorship reached past the image of Muhammad and into dialogue that had nothing to do with Muhammad at all, silencing the very speech the episode had built to argue against silencing. Section 8, 200 and 201. The speech about fear gets silenced by fear. 4 years passed between Cartoon Wars and the next major censorship event in South Park's history, and in those 4 years the show had not stopped pushing. Individual episodes had generated their own controversies, their own outrage statements from the usual organizations, their own brief cycles of coverage and response. The Parents Television Council continued monitoring. William Donahue continued issuing statements. The basic rhythm of the show's relationship with outside critics had settled into something almost predictable, where a provocative episode would air, generate a week or two of coverage, and then subside back into the general background noise of what South Park was known for doing. Nothing in those 4 years produced the kind of sustained institutional response that Trapped in the Closet or Bloody Mary had generated. The show had, in a sense, normalized its own extremity. The 200th episode of South Park aired on April 14, 2010. Parker and Stone had decided to mark the milestone not with a celebration of the show's history or a nostalgic return to early characters and situations, but with something considerably more confrontational, a storyline that reached back through almost every major target the show had ever provoked and pulled them all into a single narrative built around a question the show had been circling since Cartoon Wars. The episode is called 200, and it opens with a premise that uses the milestone itself as a structural device. Tom Cruise, appearing in his long-established South Park cartoon form, organizes a coalition of celebrities who have been mocked by the show over its 200-episode run. The coalition is enormous, pulling in figures from across the show's history history who share a single grievance. They have been ridiculed by a cartoon in front of millions of viewers, and they have had no effective recourse. Cruz's specific complaint involves being called a fudge packer in an earlier episode, a description he argues has caused lasting damage to his public image. The coalition threatens a class action lawsuit against the town of South Park unless their demand is met. The demand is specific and pointed. They want to be given Muhammad in person, because Muhammad, alone among the figures South Park has ever depicted, appears to possess the power to make himself completely immune to mockery. The celebrities want that power for themselves. This premise allowed the episode to do several things at once. It gave Parker and Stone a vehicle for revisiting virtually every significant creative choice the show had made across 200 episodes, bringing back figures and storylines that longtime viewers would recognize immediately. It also allowed the episode to address the Muhammad question directly, treating the figure's censored status as something the characters inside the show's universe had noticed and were trying to exploit. Muhammad's immunity from ridicule within the world of the episode is not a matter of religious principle or cultural sensitivity. It is a form of power, coveted by people who want protection from the specific kind of harm that being mocked on a popular television program can cause. The framing transformed the censorship of Muhammad from a solemn topic requiring careful handling into something the episode could examine with the same irreverence it brought to everything else. The super best friends return in 200 as well, called back into service as part of the storyline's escalation. Muhammad's presence within their group is handled with the same deliberate meta-commentary the show had developed since Cartoon Wars, with a censored bar placed over the character at key moments. The joke being that even within the fiction of the South Park universe, Muhammad cannot be fully shown. Parker and Stone had built this self-referential censorship into the episode's design, using it as a creative choice rather than a concession, making the impossibility of showing the character part of what the episode was about rather than simply a limitation imposed from outside. Part 1 ended on a cliffhanger, as Cartoon Wars had 4 years earlier, with the central question of Muhammad's appearance in the follow-up episode left unresolved. Viewers who had watched Cartoon Wars in 2006 recognized the structure immediately. The unresolved ending was an invitation to tune in for Part 2, where the show's argument would presumably land somewhere definitive. Between the broadcast of 200 on April 14th and the scheduled broadcast of 200 on April 21st, something happened that transformed the question from a creative and editorial one into something considerably more dangerous. An organization based in New York called Revolution Muslim posted a warning on its website directed specifically at Parker and Stone. The warning described what the two creators risked by continuing to depict Muhammad and included a photograph of Theo van Gogh, the Dutch filmmaker who had been murdered in Amsterdam in 2004 after making a short film examining violence against women in Muslim communities. The inclusion of the photograph was not explained within the posting as a threat in the legal sense of that term. The author of the post, who identified himself publicly and spoke to news organizations, including Fox News, about what he had written, described the posting as a warning about likely consequences rather than a direct threat of personal violence. He argued that Parker and Stone were putting themselves in a position similar to the one Van Gogh had occupied before his death, and that the outcome for them could be similar. The physical addresses of Comedy Central's offices in New York and the production facility in Los Angeles were included in the posting. This detail was what separated the Revolution Muslim warning from the general hostility that South Park attracted from online sources on a fairly regular basis. A statement of disapproval, however extreme in its language, does not require a security response. A statement of disapproval that includes specific physical locations where the people being warned could be found is a different category of communication entirely, and Comedy Central's legal and security teams treated it as such. The network heightened security at its offices. The situation was reported to law enforcement. The week between the two broadcasts became something that no previous South Park controversy had produced, a period where the people responsible for the show were being advised to take precautions about their physical safety. Revolution Muslim was, by most accounts that examined it closely, a small organization. A Toronto Sun columnist covering the story noted that the group's active membership appeared to number somewhere around half a dozen people. This smallness did not reduce how seriously the threat was treated, and the reason it did not reduce it was specific. The reference to Van Gogh was not abstract. Van Gogh had been killed. The murder had happened in a Western European city under circumstances that were broadly similar in structure to the one the warning was describing. A filmmaker who made work that some people considered offensive to Islam had been murdered on a public street. The posting was saying, without technically constituting a legal threat, that this was what Parker and Stone should expect. Comedy Central made its decision about 2:01 before the episode aired. When the broadcast went out on April 21st, 2010, the audience that had been following the two-parter heard something no previous South Park broadcast had produced: continuous audio bleeping covering every spoken reference to Muhammad's name throughout the episode. Every mention, not selected mentions, not moments of particular sensitivity, but but every instance across the runtime where the name was spoken by any character. The visual censorship bar was also extended beyond what Parker and Stone had built into the episode themselves, with Comedy Central's alterations going further than the self-referential censorship the creators had designed as part of the episode's own commentary. The bleeping extended into territory that had nothing to do with Muhammad at all. Kyle's closing speech, which the show's own production team had written specifically as the episode's moral statement, was buried under continuous audio bleeping from its opening words to its final line. The speech contained no mention of Muhammad. It did not describe the prophet, reference his image, or engage with any of the religious content that the network had concluded was too dangerous to air. Kyle's speech was about intimidation and fear, about how the demonstrated willingness to threaten violence had become the most effective tool available for controlling what could be said, and about how rewarding that willingness by silencing content simply confirmed that the strategy worked. Parker and Stone released a statement the following day through the South Park Studios website. The statement noted that in 14 years of making South Park, the two creators had never delivered an episode they could not stand behind. They stated plainly that Comedy Central had inserted the bleeps after they had submitted their final version of the episode, meaning the censorship the audience had just watched was not something the show had chosen or endorsed. They confirmed that Kyle's closing speech had been about intimidation and fear, and that it had contained nothing related to Muhammad, and that it had been bleeped anyway. The statement ended with a note that a new episode would be coming the following week about something completely different, and that they would see what happened to it. The specific detail about Kyle's speech is the one that drew the sharpest reaction from commentators covering the story in the days that followed. Multiple columnists and critics across different newspapers and outlets focused on the same irony. An episode arguing that fear should not be allowed to silence speech had its speech about fear silenced by fear. The argument the episode was making became the demonstration of what the episode was arguing against, not through any design on Parker and Stone's part, but through the network's decision to extend the bleeping past the religious content and into the closing moral statement. Comedy Central had not simply censored a depiction of Muhammad, it had censored an argument about censorship, removing from broadcast the exact speech that would have explained to the audience what the censorship meant. Former Comedy Central president Doug Herzog addressed the situation years later in a Hollywood Reporter oral history of the show, stating that the decision to censor and then pull 200 and 200-01 had been made as a matter of safety rather than editorial preference. His framing was direct. The network was protecting everyone who worked there. This acknowledgement, made years after the fact, confirmed what the situation's timeline had already made clear to anyone following it closely. The censorship of 2-on-1 was not a judgment that the episode's content was too offensive or too extreme for a cable audience. It was a response to a specific and credibly stated possibility of physical violence against real people, made by an organization small enough that its membership could fit inside a single room, but specific enough in its references to a real murder victim that the network concluded it could not dismiss the warning as ordinary online hostility. 200 and 201 were pulled from the broadcast rotation immediately following 201's original airing. They were removed from the South Park Studios website. They were excluded from the Hulu streaming deal that was active at the time, from the HBO Max deal that followed in 2019, and from the Paramount Plus transition that came after that. The Season 14 DVD and Blu-ray sets contain both episodes, but only in the censored broadcast versions, with the bleeps in place throughout. The uncensored audio of Kyle's closing speech, which Parker and Stone had recorded and submitted as part of their final cut of the episode, has never been officially released in any format. It exists in the production files of the show and in whatever recordings were made of the audio master before the network applied its alterations, and it has not reached any official public distribution through any channel in the years since the original broadcast. What the leaked text of Kyle's speech, which circulated online after fans and journalists reconstructed it through various means, revealed was something that made the decision to bleep it even harder to defend on any grounds beyond pure fear. The speech argued, in the direct plain language that South Park used for its clearest satirical statements, that threatening people with violence was the most powerful tool available for controlling what they were allowed to say, and that the willingness to use that tool had been proven effective. It argued that the lesson of everything that had just happened was simply that violence, or the credible threat of it, worked. The speech was not defending Muhammad or attacking him, it was describing the mechanism by which his image had become impossible to show, and concluding that the mechanism had won. Comedy Central bleeped a speech about why threatening violence works immediately after demonstrating that threatening violence works. The circularity of this outcome was total, and the network appears to have understood it, since Herzog's later account of the decision acknowledged that it had been driven entirely by safety considerations, rather than any belief that Kyle's closing words were themselves inappropriate for broadcast. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The censorship of 200 and 201 was driven by a threat from a group small enough to fit in a single room. 3 years earlier, an episode of South Park had been erased from an entire entire country's internet by an institution with the power to make that erasure complete, permanent, and total within days of a single broadcast. Section 9. Banned in China, the country that erased everything. Season 23 of South Park began on October 2, 2019, with an episode that had been constructed around a question the show's creators had been watching build for years inside the American entertainment industry. The question was not a subtle one, and Parker and Stone did not approach it subtly. Hollywood had been making increasingly visible compromises in the content of its films and television productions in order to maintain access to the Chinese market, a market large enough and valuable enough that the financial logic of accommodating it had begun overriding creative and editorial decisions that would previously have been made without reference to a foreign government's preferences. Scripts were being altered, characters were being changed, storylines involving content the Chinese government had indicated it found objectionable were being quietly removed from productions before they reached screens in China, and sometimes before they reached screens anywhere else. Parker and Stone had watched this pattern develop and had, in the way they had always responded to things they found worth examining, decided to make it the explicit subject of an episode rather than something they discussed in interviews. The episode is called Banned in China, and it runs two parallel storylines that approach the same subject from different directions, using a father and a son in the same family to show what choosing profit over principle looks like when the profit is large enough and the principle costs enough to maintain. Randy Marsh, who by season 23 had become the operator of a marijuana farm called Tegrati Farms, decides that expanding into the Chinese market represents the logical next step for his business. China has an enormous population, Randy reasons, and even a tiny percentage of that population buying his product would make him more money than he can currently imagine. He travels to China with his product to pitch it directly, arriving with the confidence of someone who has not thought carefully about what marijuana's legal status is in the country he is entering. He is arrested at the airport almost immediately. Chinese officials discover what he is carrying within moments of his arrival, and Randy's business trip becomes something else entirely before he has had time to explain himself. What follows for Randy inside the Chinese detention system is where the episode becomes most direct about what it is depicting. He is sent to a labor camp. A guard delivers an electric shock. Randy is handed a card and instructed to read the statement printed on it aloud, a statement declaring his membership in the Communist Party and his acceptance that the needs of the party outweigh the needs of any individual person. The labor camp is built to resemble the facilities in China's Xinjiang region that human rights organizations had been documenting extensively in the period leading up to the episode's broadcast. Facilities where large numbers of Uyghur Muslims had been held under conditions that Amnesty International and other organizations described as involving severe restrictions on basic freedoms and discriminatory treatment at systematic scale. The episode does not soften this reference or disguise it beneath fictional distance. Randy is inside something that looks like what the reporting described, and the episode makes no effort to suggest otherwise. The show had always operated on the principle that the most effective way to make an audience confront something was to present it plainly rather than through layers of protective exaggeration, and Banned in China applied this principle to subject matter considerably heavier than most of what the show had built around it before. Inside the labor camp, Randy encounters two other detainees who explain their own presence there. Winnie the Pooh and his companion Piglet have been imprisoned because of internet memes that drew comparisons between the round, gentle animated bear and Chinese President Xi Jinping. This detail was grounded in something that had actually been happening on Chinese internet platforms for several years before the episode aired. Users had been circulating images that placed photographs of Xi alongside frames from Winnie the Pooh animations, finding humor in a perceived physical resemblance between the two figures. The Chinese government had responded by censoring searches and images that connected the two, blocking the comparisons across the platforms it controlled, and treating what had begun as a light internet joke as something serious enough to require active suppression. Placing the actual cartoon bear in a labor camp alongside Randy made the Chinese government's response to the memes into a joke about the response itself, rather than about Xi Jinping directly. The bear had done nothing beyond existing in a form that someone outside the labor camp had found funny to compare to a powerful person. His imprisonment was the punchline, an illustration of what it looks like when a government treats an animated character as a threat serious enough to suppress through its regulatory apparatus. Stan's storyline runs alongside Randy's detention and operates through a different but connected lens. Stan and his friends form a metal band called Crimson Dawn, which gains enough local attention to be approached by a music industry manager who wants to help them develop their careers. The manager explains that the traditional music industry model is no longer financially viable on its own, and that what the band actually needs is a biographical film rather than an album. Stan, eager for any path out of his ordinary life on the marijuana farm, agrees immediately. The film production begins, and the censorship begins with it. Chinese government censors are shown physically present on the set, watching Stan write the script in real time, erasing lines and passages that fail to meet their approval as he produces them. The censors operate without explanation or apology, removing content as a matter of routine administrative function rather than as anything requiring justification. Stan watches his own story being rewritten around him and delivers the line that the episode had been building toward, that he now understands how Hollywood writers must feel. The line connects the fictional situation directly to the documented reality of what major studios had been doing with their own productions, tying the joke to something that had been reported on and discussed in the entertainment press, but rarely dramatized with this kind of directness. Mickey Mouse appears throughout the Banned in China storyline as a corporate enforcer, ensuring that the characters operating within his company's intellectual property portfolio cooperate fully with whatever the Chinese government requires. The Disney characters and Marvel figures who appear under Mickey's supervision are shown accepting the censorship as a condition of doing business, rather than as something worth resisting, and Mickey's management of the situation is depicted as cheerful and completely without moral consideration, driven entirely by the financial logic of maintaining market access. The episode names the target of this satire without any ambiguity, connecting the critique directly to the specific corporate practices of a specific real company, rather than creating a fictional analog that could be mistaken for something more general. By the end of the episode, the two storylines resolve in ways that sit directly beside each other without resolving into a single clean moral. Stan reaches the point where he refuses to continue altering his band's story to satisfy the censors, telling his bandmates that anyone willing to make that trade for money is not worth respecting. His friends agree. His storyline ends with a clear statement of principle maintained at personal cost. Randy's storyline ends differently. Randy kills Winnie the Pooh inside the labor camp in order to secure the business deal that will allow Greedy Weed to be sold legally inside China, choosing the profit over the companion he had made during his imprisonment. The final moments of the episode show Randy narrating his business success, while footage of actual unrest plays in the background, the distance between his satisfaction and the reality surrounding it left entirely without comment. The episode aired on October 2nd, 2019. The response from the Chinese government arrived within days. By Monday, October 7th, 5 days after the broadcast, The Hollywood Reporter had documented what had happened to South Park's presence on the Chinese internet. Every episode and clip of the show that had been accessible on Youku, the streaming platform owned by Alibaba and one of the primary legal channels through which Chinese audiences had been watching international content, had disappeared. Links that had previously led to South Park content now returned nothing. Discussion threads and subthreads about the show on Baidu's Tieba platform, which had functioned as one of China's largest online discussion forums with a substantial South Park community, were non-functional. Visitors who typed the URL for what had been an active South Park forum found a message stating that the section was temporarily not open according to the relevant laws and regulations. Weibo, the social media platform with hundreds of millions of monthly active users that functioned as China's primary public discussion space, showed no mention of South Park anywhere among the billions of posts in its searchable history. Not a reference, not a clip, not a fan account. The show had been present on the platform before October 2nd and was entirely absent from it after. The removal was not partial or selective, targeting the specific episode that had triggered the government's response while leaving the rest of the catalog accessible. Every trace of the show was gone from every platform the Chinese government had the ability to affect. Parker and Stone released a statement the same day the extent of the erasure was becoming clear. Their statement compared themselves directly to the NBA, which had found itself in its own significant confrontation with the Chinese government that same week, after a team executive published a tweet expressing support for pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong. The NBA had responded to the resulting backlash by pulling back, canceling broadcasts, and making conciliatory gestures toward Chinese broadcasters and sponsors. Parker and Stone's statement described their own position in terms that mirrored the NBA's behavior, while making clear they were describing it satirically rather than endorsing it. They announced that they too welcomed Chinese censors into their homes and into their hearts, that they too loved money more than freedom and democracy, and that Xi Jinping did not look anything like Winnie the Pooh. The statement concluded by wishing the Chinese Communist Party's autumn sorghum harvest well and asking whether they were good now with China. The statement was not an apology. It was the opposite of an apology, using the form of a corporate conciliation to mock every actual corporate conciliation the entertainment industry had made toward the Chinese market over the preceding decade. By placing the NBA's response and their own statement in the same sentence, Parker and Stone were making explicit what had previously been implicit in how the industry discussed its relationship with China, that the financial considerations involved were large enough to produce behavior that, described plainly, would be difficult to defend as anything other than the trading of principle for money. The collateral effects of the ban extended beyond South Park itself. DJ Zed, a German German electronic musician with a significant career and substantial financial interests tied to the Chinese market, announced that he had been permanently banned from China after liking a tweet from South Park's official account. His publicist confirmed the claim. Zed had not made any statement about China or about the episode. He had clicked a button on a social media platform in response to a post from a television show, and this action had apparently been sufficient for Chinese authorities to add his name to whatever list governed who was and was not permitted to perform or release music in the country. The specificity of this response to a social media interaction carried its own kind of information about the scale of monitoring the Chinese government was applying to foreign entertainers' engagement with content it had decided was unacceptable. Banned in China remains fully available on Paramount Plus for audiences outside China. Parker and Stone did not alter the episode, issue any form of genuine apology, or take any action suggesting they regretted what the episode contained. The Chinese ban, which removed the show from a market of over 1 billion people, produced no change in the episode's content and no change in the show's creative direction in subsequent seasons. The country that had the power to erase the show from its own internet entirely did not have the power to change what the show had said, and Parker and Stone appear to have been aware of this distinction before the episode aired. What Banned in China accomplished within the show's censorship history was something none of the previous episodes in this account had achieved. Every earlier censorship case had involved a decision made by Comedy Central, by Viacom, or by a broadcasting partner in a specific country, choosing what to air or not air through its own regulated channels. The Chinese government's response bypassed all of those layers entirely. There was no negotiation with Comedy Central. There was no request to a broadcasting partner. There was no conversation between the network and an outside organization. A government with direct control over its country's internet infrastructure simply removed the show from that infrastructure, completely and without explanation, and the removal was total in a way that no American advocacy group or religious organization had ever managed to produce across the entire length of the show's run. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. China's erasure of South Park happened within days and covered everything at once. Every other censorship battle in the show's history had been fought episode by episode, controversy by controversy, with specific organizations applying specific pressure to specific content. Section 10, The Philosophy and the Gap. South Park has argued the same basic thing for nearly 30 years. Nobody gets a permanent free pass. No religion, no government, no celebrity, no group of any kind deserves a guaranteed exemption from being made fun of, because the moment that exemption exists, the show becomes something smaller than what it is trying to be. Parker and Stone have said versions of this in interviews so many times and across so many years that the idea has become almost inseparable from the show's identity, less a creative philosophy and more a founding rule. The one thing the show treats as genuinely non-negotiable across every other controversy it has walked into and out of. The rule is simple enough that a child could understand it, and the most interesting thing about it, looked at from the end of a censorship history as long and as complicated as this one, is where it held and where it did not. Parker and Stone have stated their equal opportunity philosophy in so many interviews across so many years that the phrase has become almost automatic in any serious discussion of the show. Nobody gets permanent protection. No group, no religion, no government, no public figure deserves a guaranteed exemption from being made fun of, because the moment such an exemption is granted, the decision about who receives it stops being a principled one and starts being a political one, driven by whoever holds the most power to make the cost of mockery too high. This argument is not simply a creative preference. It is the structural justification for almost everything the show has ever done. The reason Cartman can deliver a speech borrowed from the vocabulary of genocide in one episode, and Kyle can argue for consistency and artistic freedom in another. The philosophy is the foundation. What makes the permanent streaming gap so philosophically interesting is that it does not contradict this argument through any action Parker and Stone took. They did not decide at any point to grant Muhammad permanent protection from the show's satire. They did not conclude that the Muhammad episodes had been wrong to make, or that the principle of equal treatment should have been applied differently in those specific cases. They submitted their episodes. They pushed back publicly against network interference. They issued statements making clear that the censorship applied to their work was not something they had chosen. The gap in the official catalog is not a product of the creators agreeing, eventually, that some things deserve permanent protection. It is a product of forces entirely outside their creative control, maintaining an outcome they never endorsed. This distinction matters because it reveals something about the show's philosophy that the philosophy itself rarely addresses directly. Equal opportunity offense, as a principle, describes what a show intends to do with its creative choices. It says nothing about what happens after those choices leave the writer's room and enter the distribution systems controlled by networks, streaming platforms, parent companies, and foreign governments. The principle operates inside the production process. The gap in the catalog was created entirely outside it. Parker and Stone's philosophical position has remained consistent across every controversy in this video's history. The official streaming catalog does not reflect their philosophical position because the official streaming catalog is not under their control. This is the part of the censorship story that the equal opportunity framing cannot fully account for, and it is the part that the streaming era has made impossible to ignore. When an episode is pulled from a broadcast rerun rotation and then returns after a few months, the gap is temporary enough that the philosophy survives it intact. The show argued for consistency, the network blinked briefly under pressure, the episode came back, and the overall record of what the show was willing to do remained legible in the catalog. When an episode is excluded from every successive streaming deal across more than a decade and shows no sign of returning, the gap becomes a permanent feature of the official record, and the philosophy that supposedly guides the show sits beside it without being able to explain it away. The 5 missing episodes are also, and this is where the irony sharpens considerably, the episodes most directly about the question of censorship itself. Super Best Friends was made before Muhammad's depiction was controversial and aired without incident precisely because the cultural context of 2001 had not yet made the image dangerous. Its retroactive removal is a demonstration, sitting in the catalog as a visible absence, of exactly what the Cartoon Wars episodes were arguing 4 years later. That content does not need to change in order to become censored. The world around it simply needs to move far enough that the image carries risks the original production never faced. The episode that proved this point most clearly is now one of the 5 entries missing from streaming, its absence illustrating the argument that its removal was made to prevent being illustrated. Cartoon Wars Part 1 and Part 2 are the most precisely targeted examples of this same pattern. 2 episodes built entirely around the argument that fear of violent reaction should not determine what a network is allowed to broadcast are among the 5 entries that a network has decided, across multiple successive agreements, it is not comfortable making available on streaming. The argument those episodes make is legible in the text of the episodes themselves, but the episode's own streaming status has been providing a live demonstration of the counter-argument for more than a decade. Comedy Central did not give in when the Cartoon Wars episodes were first negotiated over. It gave in when 200 and 201 produced a threat specific enough to move from online hostility into something the network's legal and security teams felt required a physical response. The Cartoon Wars episode's exclusion from streaming is a downstream consequence of events they did not directly produce, which makes their absence feel both logically connected to everything they argued and cruelly disconnected from the specific creative choices that produced them. 200 and 201 are the most straightforward examples of the same pattern, and also the ones where the philosophical gap is sharpest and most uncomfortable to sit with. Kyle's closing speech in 201 argued, directly and without ambiguity, that threatening people with violence was the most reliable method for controlling what they were allowed to say. The speech was bleeped before anyone heard it. It has remained bleeped in every official format since. The speech that described how silencing works got silenced, and the official record of the show that built its identity on saying things that other shows would not say preserves that silencing as the permanent version of the episode, in every format where the episode exists at all. The streaming generation's relationship to these 5 episodes is worth examining separately from the question of their availability, because it has produced something unusual in the history of television censorship, a body of content that is more discussed and more mythologized precisely because it cannot be accessed normally. The audience that came to South Park through streaming rather than through cable broadcast or DVD grew up in a relationship with these 5 episodes that is fundamentally different from their relationship with the 320-something episodes sitting beside them in the official catalog. Their jokes can be checked, their arguments followed, their quality assessed directly. The 5 missing episodes have to be understood through description, through secondhand accounts, through reconstructed transcripts, through recordings of uncertain provenance circulating in corners of the internet where the show's official distribution does not reach. This is what censorship produces in the digital age, when it is thorough enough to exclude content from every official streaming platform, but not thorough enough to make the content entirely inaccessible. It creates myth. The 5 missing South Park episodes have accumulated a cultural weight among the streaming generation that most of the episodes available on Paramount Plus will never achieve, not because the missing episodes are necessarily better than the ones that can be watched freely, but because their unavailability has made them into objects of desire rather than simply objects. Scarcity, even artificial scarcity, created by institutional caution rather than genuine rarity, produces a kind of attention that full availability rarely generates on its own. The lost media community, which emerged as an organized effort to locate and preserve television and film content that had fallen out of official distribution for various reasons, has treated several of the Muhammad-related South Park episodes with the same archival seriousness it applies to genuinely lost television from the pre-digital era. The uncensored audio of Kyle's speech in 201 is treated within this community community as something worth searching for and preserving with the same care that genuinely irreplaceable recordings receive. The fact that the audio exists somewhere in a production archive belonging to a functioning and financially healthy studio and has simply never been officially released gives the search a particular character. This is not content lost to the degradation of physical media or the carelessness of institutions that did not understand what they were discarding. It is content that someone is actively choosing not to release, which means the lost media framing does not quite fit, and the censorship framing fits uncomfortably well. What Parker and Stone's consistent refusal to alter the missing episodes actually reveals about the nature of the censorship that produced their absence is something the equal opportunity philosophy was never designed to address and cannot fully resolve. If the episodes were wrong in some way, the creators could correct. Altering them to produce a version acceptable for streaming would be a straightforward decision. The creators have never suggested the episodes were wrong. The network has never suggested the episodes were wrong in ways that could be fixed. The safety considerations that drove the exclusion were not about the content of the episodes, but about what showing the content might cause outside the studio, in the real world, at the hands of people with no connection to the production at all. This is a kind of censorship the equal opportunity philosophy cannot push back against through argument, because the argument has already been made, clearly and publicly, in the text of the episodes themselves, and in every statement Parker and Stone have issued about the situation. The argument did not win, not because it was wrong, but because the force that produced the censorship was not interested in the argument. Revolution Muslim was not waiting to hear a persuasive case for consistency in artistic freedom before reconsidering its position. The Chinese government was not weighing Parker and Stone's stated principles against its decision to scrub the show from its internet. The institutions capable of producing the most permanent outcomes in South Park's censorship history were not the ones engaged in the kind of debate the show was built to participate in. What the streaming era has ultimately revealed is that the equal opportunity philosophy is most effective when the forces capable of censoring the show are ones that care about appearing consistent, reasonable, or fair. A parent organization cares about those things. A religious institution operating in a democratic society with a free press cares about those things. Even a corporate parent with financial relationships at stake cares, to some degree, about being seen to act on principle rather than purely on pressure. The forces that produced the 5 permanent absences in South Park's streaming catalog were not operating inside that framework at all. They were operating inside a simpler one, where the question was not whether their position was principled, but whether it was effective. And it was. South Park spent nearly 30 years saying that nothing should be off limits, that no group or religion or government deserves a permanent free pass from being made fun of. And then 5 episodes that tested exactly that idea ended up missing from the official catalog, quietly excluded from every streaming deal, year after year, with no sign of coming back. 5 out of more than 300, a small number, but they happened to be the 5 episodes where the show pushed hardest on the one thing it had always argued against, the idea that some subjects are simply too dangerous to touch. Turns out, some of them were, and the show was right about why. It just could not do anything about it. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.